It's a classic rabbinic cliche to say that miraculously, somehow the Torah portion always manages to speak exactly to the moment that we're living through. But it's a cliche that also happens to be true. And this week, more than any week that I can remember, truly, and I mean that truly, the Torah is speaking directly to us very loudly and very clearly. This morning we read Parshat Noach, which recounts the destruction of the world. God sees that the world's moral deterioration has become so great that God has no choice but to eradicate humanity and start civilization anew. And what's the word that the text uses to describe all of the hatred, all of the violence, all of the evil that defined the state of the world before the flood? Mark, what's the word? The word is Hamas. It's right there in the text in this week's Torah portion. V'tishachet ha'aretz lifnei ha'Elohim v'timaleh ha'aretz Hamas. The earth became corrupt before God. It was filled with Hamas, with violence. In Hebrew, the word Hamas means violence. In Arabic, the word Hamas means zeal. And in both Hebrew and Arabic, the word is etymologically connected to the ancient Akkadian word chamisu, which means to oppress. In other words, when you hear the word Hamas, it evokes violence, religious zealotry, oppression. And there's a great deal of commentary among our classical sages about what precisely the nature of the Hamas, the violence, was that caused God to decide to wipe out humanity. Ibn Ezra, the 12th century Spanish commentator, said that Hamas in this context means that before the flood, people were kidnapping and raping women. Chizkuni, the 13th century French commentator, taught that Hamas means that before the flood, people were senselessly spilling innocent blood. Rabbi Ishmael in the Talmud said that the word Hamas here simply means that the world has become overrun with corruption. And the truth is, Hamas probably means all of those things. Rape, murder, corruption, things which the Jewish people have associated with the word Hamas for thousands of years. And if there's one thing that you can say about the terrorist organization known as Hamas, it's that they are doing an excellent job of living up to their biblical namesake. We all went to sleep on October 6th in one world, and we woke up on the morning of October 7th, exactly 2 weeks ago this morning, in a very different world. A much darker world, a world none of us want to live in, all thanks to Hamas. 2 weeks ago, on Shmini Atzeret, the end of the time on the Jewish calendar known as Zman Simchatenu, the time of our great joy, Hamas launched the bloodiest attack in Israeli history. A full-scale invasion from the Gaza Strip. Hundreds of Hamas terrorists fanned out across Israel's southern communities, Kibbutz Nachal Oz, Kibbutz Be'eri, Ofakim, and many more, home to thousands of innocent people simply trying to live their lives. Terrified Israelis all across the region huddled in their bomb shelters and their safe rooms for hours on end as they waited for the horrific carnage to come to a close. And make no mistake, carnage is precisely what Hamas set out to do. They crossed the border and they came into Israel to rape, to kidnap, to senselessly spill as much innocent blood as they possibly could. All of the things that our tradition has associated with the word Hamas since the time of the flood. And all of the things which caused God to decide to wipe out humanity in order to free the world from the evil known as Hamas. The terrorist organization Hamas is actually an acronym which stands for Harakat al-Mukawama al-Islamiyah, the Islamic resistance movement. But of course, their choice of that acronym, Hamas, was intentional. It's intended to evoke all of the other implications of the word: violence, zealotry, oppression. In their genocidal founding charter in 1988, they called for the liberation of every inch of Palestine, which, according to them, could only be achieved through jihad, through Islamic holy war, which would result in the death of every single Jewish person. But in 2017, Hamas revised their charter, and it became a much more moderate, tempered document. This new charter called for a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as its capital along the borderlines of June 4th, 1967, the day before the start of the Six-Day War. And they also went out of their way in that 2017 revised charter to say that they're not anti-Jewish, they're simply anti-Zionist. It's a much softer document than the 1988 document. And all of their recent talks with Israel, especially since the last war in 2021, in all of those talks, Hamas gave the impression that their primary focus was no longer terrorism, it was now economics, getting additional permits to allow more Gazans to work within Israel, easing restrictions at checkpoints and border crossings. The message that Hamas was consistently sending, day after day, was that they had put this whole genocidal campaign behind them and that they were no longer interested in wiping Israel and the Jewish people off the face of the earth. We now know it was all a ruse. It was a scheme, years worth of obfuscation and deception. Hamas hoped that Israel would let its guard down so that they could successfully plan and execute the deadliest attack in Israeli history. And it worked. Hamas has been planning this moment for years. And what we now have to grapple with and learn to come to terms with is the fact that they were able to plan and carry out the bloodiest attack in modern Jewish history, all directly under the nose of Israel. But even if Hamas outsmarted us strategically, I am very proud to say that Israel has and will always have the moral upper hand. Hamas celebrates the death of innocent civilians. They intentionally attacked Israel with the express goal of massacring as many innocent people as they possibly could. Babies, mothers, Holocaust survivors. They act with no regard whatsoever for the value of human life. Israel, on the other hand, does everything in its power to avoid killing innocent civilians. And they deeply regret it when they do. Hamas revels in the fact that they took 200 Israeli hostages, that they desecrated corpses, that they murdered young children. We know that they revel in these things because they film them and they broadcast them very proudly all over the internet. All things which, of course, Israel would never, ever do. Which is not to say that Israel is perfect. Israel is not perfect. No country in the world is perfect. Israel, like any other country, has made all kinds of mistakes throughout its history. But to try to establish a sense of moral equivalency between the atrocities of Hamas and the way that Israel engages with Palestinians is absolutely appalling. Hamas intentionally uses its own people as human shields. Its own people. They strategically place innocent non-combatants, women and children in the line of fire because they know that placing them there will make Israel reluctant to attack. Because Hamas understands that Israel has a higher moral code, and they use that knowledge as a weapon against Israel. Hamas fires rockets from hospitals, from schools, from mosques, sites filled with civilians, which are intentionally chosen for the sake of creating as much carnage as possible when Israel retaliates. Because Hamas also knows that when Israel inevitably fires back and kills innocent Palestinian women and children, the world will turn its back on Israel. We're already seeing it happen. Thousands of innocent Palestinians have died over the past 2 weeks, and thousands more will die. And that's a tragedy. It's a genuine tragedy. But always remember, Israel does everything in its power to avoid killing innocent civilians. Hamas, on the other hand, has no issue killing not only Jewish women and children, but killing their own women and children. That is pure evil. It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable to think that Israel would ever use its own children as human shields. But Hamas is doing precisely that every single day. That's the definition of evil. And shame on anyone who tries to establish a sense of moral equivalency between Israel and Hamas, including I'm sorry to say it, including Jews. Israel and Hamas live in two completely different moral universes. The ultimate losers in this war won't be the Israelis. It won't be Hamas, which will be destroyed. The real losers of this war will be the innocent Palestinians in Gaza. Hamas just dragged Gaza into a war that it has no hope of winning. And it should now be abundantly clear to the entire world that Hamas never had the best interests of the Palestinian people at heart. Hamas's decision to attack Israel in the most horrific way imaginable on October 7th was also an intentional decision to inflict pain and suffering and death upon their own people. Hamas knew that Israel would have no choice but to retaliate, which would result in the death of thousands of innocent Palestinians. And even with that knowledge, they went ahead and attacked Israel anyway. Yes, it's true that Hamas has Jewish blood on their hands, a lot of it. But by the time this war is over, they will have much, much more Palestinian blood on their hands. And I want to be very clear about this point. As far as I'm concerned, the deaths of those innocent civilians in Gaza are not attributable to Israel. They are attributable entirely to Hamas. Thousands of years ago, humanity had descended into a state of violence, a state of chaos, a state of moral depravity. So God sent a flood to wipe out civilization for one reason and one reason only: to destroy that sense of Hamas that had come to define the world. God wiped out Hamas thousands of years ago. Israel will wipe out Hamas today. At the end of the flood story, when the rains have finally stopped, Noah, who had been in the ark with his family and all of the animals throughout the flood, sends out a dove to see if the waters had receded enough for the ark's passengers to disembark. And that dove very famously returns with an olive branch in its beak. And in a midrash on that story, the rabbis teach that that olive branch came from an olive tree on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, which means that the dove was conveying to Noah that Hamas, that violence, corruption, and evil had come to an end in the land of Israel. And that's why the dove came to be a symbol of shalom, a symbol of peace. Once Hamas was destroyed, peace was able to return to the world. That was true during the time of the flood. May it also come to be true speedily in our days. Ufros aleinu sukat domecha ve'al kol amo Israel ve'al Yerushalayim. Spread over us your shelter of peace, over us, over all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. And let us say, Amen.